I remember the way the porch light glowed that evening, soft and yellow against the damp Salem air, the kind of light that makes a house look warmer than it really feels once you step inside. I sat in my car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the engine tick itself cool. I told myself it was just another Sunday dinner, nothing more than a family get-together to celebrate my younger sister's engagement. But something in my chest already felt tight, the way it always did whenever I walked back into that house. Before I take you into that night, let me ask you something. What are you doing while listening to this story right now? I always wonder. Because on nights like that one, I wished someone out there understood how it felt to walk into a room full of people who share your blood, yet make you feel like an outsider. For me, I was pulling into my parents' driveway, trying to convince myself everything would be fine. I stepped out of the car, smoothing my shirt as if that could prepare me for the noise waiting inside. My mom had sent a group message earlier, saying it would be a small celebration. Just family. Just dinner. Just Chloe's big news. Just had a way of shrinking me before I even arrived. When I pushed the door open, the familiar smell of her baked chicken and rosemary drifted out. My sister Chloe, 28 and proud of it, stood in the dining room, glowing like she had swallowed the sun. Her fiancé, Evan Blake, tall and polished in that gentle tech worker way, hovered beside her like he was afraid of touching anything in our house too, firmly. My brother Mason was pouring himself sweet tea while Dad talked loudly about football, as if the night revolved around him instead of the engagement we were supposedly celebrating. Mom spotted me first. "Harper, there you are, honey. We were waiting for you." Except they never were. Not really. I walked to the table, placed the small arrangement of vintage brass napkin rings I had restored over the weekend in front of her. I thought maybe Mom would appreciate something handmade, something personal. She picked it up and smiled just a little too tight. "Oh, sweetie, we don't really use the rustic look anymore, but thank you." She set it aside like a gift from a polite coworker. I took my seat. Chloe was already deep into telling everyone how Evan proposed at a vineyard outside Eugene, how she cried, how he cried, how strangers clapped. Da hung on every word. Mom dabbed at the corner of her eye. Even Mason looked impressed. I waited for a lull, the way I always do when I want to be heard without being shoved aside. And when Chloe paused to drink her wine, I finally spoke. "I worked on something interesting this week. A client in Seattle asked me to restore an old 19th century writing cabinet. The wood grain is still beautiful even though it was damaged, and Dad cut me off before I could finish. "Harper, stop!" His voice sharp, one hand lifted like he was swatting a fly. "You go on and on about that old furniture of yours. You sound pathetic when you try to make it a big deal." The table went silent for a beat. Then Chloe laughed in that light little way she does when she wants attention, drawn back to her. "Oh, come on, Dad." She turned to me. "Harp, just lie next time. Tell him you do design or something. You do not want to embarrass us in front of my fiancé." Us. Embarrass us. She said it with a grin like it was funny. Evan shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't say anything. Mason snorted. Mom let out a small laugh. The kind people do just to stay on the safe side of someone else's cruelty. They all laughed. At me. About me. As if I had stepped into the role they expected me to play. The older sister who never quite lived up to the script. The one with the strange career that didn't sound impressive over dinner. The one whose dreams never aligned with the family picture in my dad's head. For a second, I wasn't 32 anymore. I was 14 again, standing in that same dining room, holding a ribbon I had won at a local art show. I remember walking up to Dad, excited to show him something that felt like mine, but he barely glanced at it because Chloe had come home, waving a small certificate from school for perfect attendance. He hugged her. I stood there with my ribbon in my hand, heat rising in my cheeks, feeling invisible. That memory hit me so hard I could almost smell the dust on that old ribbon. Back at the dinner table, no one noticed I had gone quiet. Chloe had already launched back into her engagement story. Evan had regained his smile. Dad leaned back, satisfied, after delivering another little blow. It was strange how normal all of it felt, like this had been rehearsed 100 times before. Maybe it had. I swallowed, pushing down the ache in my throat. I rose from my chair slowly, so it wouldn't scrape against the hardwood. I placed my napkin on the table. I have an early morning tomorrow. I should get going. Mom blinked up at me. Already, honey. David didn't look at me. Mason kept scrolling on his phone. Chloe waved a small hand like she was dismissing a waiter. I walked out without another word. If I had stayed even a second longer, I would have said something I could never take back. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have for late summer. I walked to my car, each step heavy but familiar. This wasn't the first time they made me feel small, but something inside me knew it had to be the last. 1 week from that night, Cole would be walking down the aisle at Maplewood Estate, the wedding she had dreamed about since she was a kid, and I would be there too. Not as a bridesmaid she barely cared to include, not as the older sister they tolerated, but in a way none of them could see coming. I pulled out of the driveway, hands shaking just slightly. The road looked darker than usual, long and quiet, the way Oregon backroads get when the streetlights thin out. For a few minutes I let the silence fill the car, letting my breath settle. If you have ever been belittled by your own family, if you have ever been the one sitting at a table full of people who should love you but somehow make you feel small, I want to hear it. Those moments shape us more than we admit. By the time I reached my workshop in Corvallis, the hurt had settled into something sharper, something that felt strangely like clarity. I unlocked the door, stepped into the familiar scent of wood shavings and varnish, and let the darkness hold me still for a moment. That night, driving through the quiet, something inside me shifted in a way I didn't fully understand yet. All I knew was that I was done being small for them, and the wedding was only 7 days away. When I stepped into my workshop that next morning, the light came in through the high windows in thin gray lines. My head still felt heavy from the night before, the words of my family clinging to me like dust. I brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead and sat at my drafting table, trying to breathe through the ache that kept rising in my chest. My laptop chimed. A new email. For a moment, I expected another message from my mom pretending nothing happened. Or maybe one of Chloe's cheerful reminders about dress colors or decor themes. Instead, the name at the top made my shoulders loosen just a little. Arthur Holmes. Arthur had been in the restoration world longer than I had been alive. 67 years old, quiet eyes, hands that moved like he had known wood his whole life. He had mentored me through some of my toughest projects, and he was one of the few people who ever looked at my work with genuine respect. His message was brief. He said a producer in Seattle had been asking about restoration artists with a vintage style. He had passed along my name and told them I might be exactly what they were looking for. He added that if I could make it to Seattle by early afternoon, there was someone he wanted me to meet. For the first time since that dinner, a small spark cut through the heaviness. I left my coffee half full, locked up the shop, and drove north, letting the passing forests pull some of the bitterness out of me. The studio sat in an old brick building near downtown Seattle, the kind that had probably been a warehouse a lifetime ago. I checked in at the front desk and waited in a hallway filled with framed posters for documentaries and home renovation specials. I felt out of place in my jeans and simple jacket, but I sat up straighter when the door opened and a man around my age stepped out. He introduced himself as Jacob Reed, 35. Neatly trimmed beard, clear blue eyes that gave off a calm kind of confidence. He told me he was a producer for a series called American Restoration Stories. They were planning a special episode that would be filmed at a wedding venue in Portland and needed an artist who could provide custom restored pieces. He said someone described my work as vintage but refined. He said that was exactly the tone they wanted. I asked him what kind of pieces they were looking for. He talked about entry tables, podiums, maybe a refurbished love seat for photos. He said the wedding was significant, a feature event for the show. He added that they were hoping to highlight the craftsmanship behind the decor, rather than just the ceremony. Listening to him talk, something warm filled my chest. The part of me that always worked alone, always heard my family dismiss my work as a hobby, suddenly felt seen. I told him I was interested. He smiled at that and said he was glad. I had no idea then that I had just agreed to work on my sister's wedding. After we wrapped up, he handed me a folder with the initial schedule. I tucked it under my arm and left the building feeling strangely weightless, almost hopeful. But that feeling didn't last long. Halfway down the freeway, my phone buzzed again. It was one of my clients, Mrs. Porter, the kind of woman who wanted everything done yesterday. She asked about her console table for the third time that week. Her messages came in quick bursts, all demanding updates and photos and assurances. My heart started pounding the way it always did when I felt pulled in too many directions. I tried to answer calmly, telling her I was on schedule. She replied instantly with a long paragraph that made my stomach twist. That old, familiar pressure returned. The sense that no matter how hard I worked, someone was always waiting to remind me it was never enough. The sky outside the windshield blurred as I drove. I felt that old ache again. The one that had started at the dinner table. I hated that Chloe's words were still echoing. I hated even more that Dad's voice had cut deeper than I wanted to admit. For a moment, the stress pulled me back years. I remembered being 20, sanding the legs of an old table in the garage behind my parents' house. My mom had walked in carrying a basket of laundry and barely looked at what I was doing. She told me I needed to be practical. She said working with my hands would ruin my future. She said no one would ever take me seriously if I kept chasing little hobbies. Her voice carried the same tone she used when she reminded me to wash dishes or turn off lights. As if my dreams were chores she expected me to outgrow. I blinked hard to push the memory aside. The road stretched ahead in a long line of gray. I turned the radio on just to drown out the replay in my head. When I got back to my workshop, the folder Jacob had given me was still under my arm. I sat at my work table, took a breath, and opened it. The first few pages were production notes, timelines and diagrams showing where each restored piece would be placed at, the venue. Then I reached a sheet that listed the event details. Venue: Maplewood Estate, Portland, Oregon. Ceremony couple: Chloe Lane and Evan Blake. My fingers stopped on the page. My breath caught in my throat. Maplewood Estate was where Chloe was getting married in less than a week. I sat there staring at the names written in clean black ink, the room around me suddenly too quiet. For a few long seconds, everything inside me went still. The humiliation at the dinner table, the laughter, David's voice telling me to stop, Chloe's whisper about not embarrassing them, all of it folded itself into that single realization. I had just agreed to restore the centerpiece items for my golden sister's wedding. And not privately, not quietly, on camera. I leaned back slowly, the folder still open in my hands. I could feel something shifting again, deeper this time. Something that felt like the beginning of a storm forming far off the coast. I did not know yet if this was fate, karma, or just a strange twist of timing. All I knew was that the path ahead had changed, and there was no turning back now. I closed the folder slowly, letting the edges fall together as if the paper itself might steady me. For a moment, I just sat there, elbows on the work table, palms pressed against my eyes until the pressure eased the tightness in my chest. The thought of being anywhere near Chloe's wedding made my stomach twist. The idea of working on it, of my pieces, standing in the middle of her perfect day, felt unreal. A part of me wanted to email Jacob right away and withdraw, to say something had come up, to disappear before anyone connected the dots. But I did not send the email. Instead, I called Arthur. He answered after the second ring, his deep voice warm and familiar. I told him everything in a rush, from the producer in Seattle to the folder to the names printed on the event sheet. I told him I was thinking of stepping back before it turned into something messy. There was a long pause on the line, and then he spoke with that steady tone of his that always made me listen. Harper, nobody gets to shrink your talent. Not your dad, not your sister, not anybody planning a wedding. You earned this offer. You did this with your own 2 hands. Do not let anyone push you into the shadows. I sat there holding the phone, feeling every word settle into me. He was right, and I knew it. My family had a way of making me feel like I did not belong anywhere, but this opportunity had nothing to do with them. It came from my work, my reputation, my craft. I thanked him quietly, and when we hung up, I felt something inside me shift again, like a window opening in a room that had gone stuffy for years. The next morning, I drove to Maplewood Estate for the initial walkthrough. The sun filtered through the tall fir trees surrounding the property, and the building rose in pale stone against a wide green lawn. It was beautiful in a way that made you slow down just to take it in. I parked near the service entrance and took a breath before stepping out. Even with the nerves twisting in my stomach, a small part of me felt proud that my work had been chosen for a place like this. Inside, a man with rolled-up sleeves, perfectly styled hair, and a clipboard tucked under his arm greeted me with a bright smile. He introduced himself as Elliot Monroe, the wedding planner. His voice had an easy warmth, the kind that made you feel welcome, even if you did not know where to stand. He looked over my portfolio images on his tablet as we walked. "You have an eye, Harper. Clean lines, but still soulful. Most artists either drown the past or ignore it. You balance it. That's rare." The compliment hit me deeper than I expected. I nodded, murmuring thanks as he led me through the grand hall. The venue opened up in soft creams and golds, with tall arched windows that let the daylight spill across the polished floors. I imagined my restored pieces here, imagined the grain of old oak glinting in the light, the carved legs casting delicate shadows. The space seemed to hum with possibilities. We walked into the ceremony room, and Elliot gestured to the front. "This is where the podium will go. Classic, but elegant, something with presence. Not too ornate." When we moved to the reception hall, he pointed to 2 spots near the entry. "Here for the console tables. We want them to be the first thing guests see when they walk in. Something that sets the tone. Not stuffy, but intentional." My mind began sketching shapes and lines, color tones, angles. I could see it forming, the way I always did when I knew a project mattered. But just as the ideas began to fill my thoughts, a familiar voice carried faintly down the hallway. It was soft at first, then clearer as a group of people stepped out from a side room. I turned before I could stop myself. Through the open doorway, I caught sight of her. Chloe stood on a raised platform, wrapped in a wedding gown with lace sleeves. Her hair had been pinned in loose curls, and her reflection glowed in the surrounding mirrors. Mom stood nearby, clutching her hands together, smiling that soft mother smile she always saved for Chloe. A few bridesmaids fluttered around, adjusting the train of the dress and complimenting every detail. They did not see me. I stayed behind the doorframe, half hidden by a tall floral arrangement. My breath caught, though I could not explain why. Maybe it was the sight of her so perfectly placed in the center of the world. Maybe it was the memory of how easily I'd been dismissed the night before. Or maybe it was the realization that I was here, working, quietly, invisibly, while she floated through her perfect day. Elliot glanced at me, then toward the dress fitting room, understanding something he did not comment on. He simply cleared his throat gently and moved us along without making it awkward. Jacob arrived shortly after with his camera assistant, offering a quick wave. He reviewed the notes with me and confirmed the list of pieces. 1 love seat restored to a 1930s romantic style, 2 console tables with carved detail, and 1 podium with a natural wood finish. He gave me a timeline, asked if I needed anything, and then hurried off to scout outdoor lighting. When I left the estate, the sky was beginning to turn gold. I walked back to my car, the gravel crunching under my boots. As soon as I sat in the driver's seat, the thoughts that had been tugging at me all morning came crashing in at once. Seeing Chloe in her gown, hearing Elliot praise my work, remembering Dad's voice calling me pathetic, remembering Mom's laugh, all of it mixed into something sharp and unsteady. My hand trembled slightly on the steering wheel. I took a slow breath, then another. The kind that settles you when you are standing at a crossroads you did not expect to find yourself at. I whispered the words out loud, as if saying them would anchor me. I am going to do this, and I am going to make it more beautiful than anything they have ever seen. The words lingered in the quiet of the car as the sun dipped lower, and it felt like the first honest promise I had made to myself in a very long time. I drove back to Corvallis with the sun sinking low behind the hills, and by the time I reached my workshop, the sky had turned a deep blue that felt almost heavy. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, letting the familiar scent of sawdust and linseed oil wrap around me like a blanket. This place had always been my refuge, the only space where my hands and my heart seemed to work in harmony. Now it was also the place where I would build the pieces that would stand at Chloe's wedding. I set my bag down and pulled my hair back, ready to start sketching out measurements. when a soft knock rattled the side door. It startled me because no one ever used that entrance. I walked over and opened it slowly. A young man stood there, holding a small toolbox and looking both nervous and hopeful at the same time. He introduced himself as Tommy Wynn, 26 years old, recently graduated from a community college woodworking program in Albany. He said he had heard through a local supplier that I sometimes took on apprentices and wondered if I had space for someone willing to learn and work hard. His voice wavered a little, as if he expected me to turn him away. I studied him quietly for a moment. His hands were calloused in a way that told me he actually worked with tools. His eyes held that spark of someone who wanted to build something that mattered. I remembered being that young, walking into Arthur's shop with the same mix of fear and eagerness. I stepped aside and told him to come in. We spent the next hour going through my current designs for the wedding pieces. I showed him the rough sketch for the 1930s love seat, the console tables with hand-carved detailing, and the podium with clean lines that still carried a classic weight. He listened carefully, asked questions that showed he understood the craft, and when I handed him a sanding block to test his technique, his hands moved with surprising skill. I told him he could stay and help if he wanted. His entire face lit up like someone had turned on a lamp inside him. The next few days settled into a rhythm. Mornings started early. Sometimes, before the sun came up, I would find Tommy already in the workshop, prepping wood or wiping down the workbench. We shaped the love seat's frame first, bending the curved back piece with steam and clamps. The wood felt alive under my fingers, warm from the heat and smooth from the grain. Tommy helped steady it as we adjusted each angle. There were moments I caught myself inhaling deeply, letting the smell of freshly sanded oak fill my lungs. There was something about this work that quieted the noise inside me, even when the noise tried to push its way back in. Like the moment my phone buzzed with a message from the family group chat. Cole had sent a link to the bridesmaid dresses. She wrote that fittings were scheduled for midweek and that she had already added me to the appointment list. The dress was pale blush, silky, tight at the waist, the kind of thing she loved, but I would never wear on my own. Mom followed up in the chat, telling me it was important for the whole family to look coordinated, that we had a responsibility to present a united front, since so many people would be attending. I stared at the messages, the words blurring slightly. My pulse tightened. It felt like they were tugging the same strings they always used to control me. Before I could think too long about it, I set my phone face down on the work table. Then I turned the ringer off completely. I did not answer them. I focused instead on the love seat, on the curves of the wood beneath my palms, on the lines I was shaping, on the way the project began to come alive. The silence in the shop was a grateful thing. Later that week, we ran into our first problem. One of the carved side pieces had split clean down the middle as we were shaping the joint. It sounded like a small crack at first, then a soft pop that made my entire body tense. I lifted the piece in my hands and felt a cold wave wash through me. We were already pressed for time. A setback like this could cost days. My breathing quickened, that old panic rising. The same one that had followed me around since childhood. The same one that whispered that I would always mess things up. The same voice I heard one afternoon when I was 10 years old. I had spent hours trying to make a wooden jewelry box for my mom using scraps from the garage. I sanded it endlessly until my fingers were sore. But the moment I tried to attach the lid, the hinge slipped and the wood cracked. Dad came in just as it happened. He barely looked at the box before saying, "I made garbage." And worse, he told Mom to throw it away before it cluttered the house. I remember standing there, feeling something break inside me right along with that box. That memory came back so sharply I had to close my eyes. When I opened them, I felt Tommy standing next to me. He held out his hand for the broken piece. "We can fix this," he said quietly. His tone was steady, not panicked. I watched as he examined the crack with a careful eye. He suggested cutting along the break to smooth the edges and reinforcing them, joint from beneath, with a hidden oak spline. It was a technique Arthur had taught me years ago, but in my stress, I had not even thought of it. We worked together through the afternoon, matching the grain, shaving tiny slivers until the seam vanished into the natural pattern of the wood. By the time we stepped back, the piece looked whole again, better than before. I exhaled slowly, the tension sliding from my shoulders. I thanked Tommy. He smiled softly, like he understood more than he let on. As the days passed, the love seat began to take its shape. The frame was smooth and sturdy, the elegant lines curving gently, just like the old photographs of 1930s furniture I had studied. The legs gleamed with dark stain, catching the light in a way that made them look almost carved from liquid shadow. Arthur stopped by one afternoon to check our progress. He circled the love seat slowly, running his fingers along the polished frame, inspecting every detail like a man studying a rare artifact. When he reached the front corner, he stepped back, eyebrows rising in surprise. He let out a low whistle and whispered under his breath in that gravelly voice of his. Chloe does not deserve this level of magic. I felt a small, steady heat rise inside my chest. Not anger, not bitterness, just truth settling where it needed to settle. I ran my hand along the smooth frame, feeling the promise of what it would become once the velvet and brass were added. For the first time since the dinner that broke something inside me, I felt the faintest flicker of pride returning. The love seat was only the beginning. I walked around it slowly, letting my fingertips follow the smooth curve of the frame. For the first time in a long while, I felt grounded. But the feeling lasted only until my phone buzzed again on the work table. At first, I ignored it. Then it buzzed a second time, then a third. When I glanced down, my stomach tightened. There were missed calls from Mom, a string of messages from the family group chat, and finally, a new text from my mom that simply said to call her immediately. I stared at the screen for a long moment before picking it up. She answered on the first ring. Her voice was clipped, sharp around the edges the way it always got when Chloe was upset. "Harper, why have you not answered any of the messages? You missed the dress fitting, and your sister is beside herself. This wedding is important. You need to stop being difficult and come to the house so we can talk." There it was again. That quiet accusation wrapped inside concern. I told her I was working and could not talk long. She insisted I come by anyway. The tone in her voice was not a request. It was an order. Against my better judgment, I drove to their house that evening. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt thick. Chloe was nowhere to be seen. But Dad stood in the living room with his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of irritation and judgment. Mom sat on the sofa with several wedding binders spread out like she had been, preparing for a board meeting. Dad spoke first. "Harper, we need to make something clear before the wedding. You have to conduct yourself properly. No disappearing acts, no arriving late, no causing scenes. This is Chloe's day, not yours." Those words hit harder than he probably realized, or maybe he knew exactly what he was saying. I kept my voice steady as I asked what exactly he thought I would do. He waved a hand as if swatting away a pointless question. "Just behave graciously and look like you belong. Your sister has worked very hard on this event." I did not tell him that the love seat she wanted for her wedding, the one she had saved inspiration photos for, was the very piece I was building in my workshop. I did not say a word about the show or the producers or the tables I was crafting for the entrance hall. I let him talk to me like a child who needed correction. I let him believe I was small. Mom cleared her throat and gestured for me to sit. She opened one of her binders and flipped through several pages before sliding a sheet toward me. It was a mood board of inspiration photos for the wedding. Gold accents, vintage elements, blush florals, elegant fabrics. At the center was a picture that made my breath catch. A green velvet 1930s love seat with carved wooden details, the exact style of the one I was restoring. I stared at the image for a few seconds, unsure whether to laugh or marvel at the irony. Mom leaned in to admire it. "Chloe has such refined taste. She always knows exactly what she wants." I swallowed the smile that threatened to rise. She had no idea the love seat in that picture was halfway finished in my workshop, shaped by my hands, not Chloe's imagination. David cleared his throat again, as if trying to regain control of the conversation. "Your sister is an event planner, and she knows what the public expects. You need to follow her lead and present yourself well." His words faded into a distant hum as another memory pulled me backwards. I am 17 years old, standing backstage at the high school graduation ceremony. Chloe, in her bright honor sash, waiting to deliver her speech as valedictorian. My parents were out front, snapping pictures, bragging to relatives, hugging her friends. I stood behind the curtain holding the small award I had received for my senior art project. A plaque no one asked about. A moment no one noticed. When I tried to show it to them after the ceremony, they barely looked up from Chloe's crowd of admirers. That feeling of being swallowed by her spotlight had never really left me. It had only changed shape as I grew older. Mom's voice brought me back to the present. She was outlining dress colors and dinner schedules, and where I needed to stand for family photos. David added that I should make sure not to draw attention away from the couple. I nodded silently, letting their words wash over me without sinking in. Eventually I stood, offering a quiet apology for the missed messages. Mom reached out to touch my arm, her expression softening just enough to pass as affection. Try to do better, Harper. This is a very big day. I walked out of the house with their voices still echoing faintly behind me. When I reached my car, I sat for a long minute with my hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing through the tightness building in my chest. They still did not see me. Not really. Not after all these years. Not even when I stood right in front of them. But this time, the hurt sharpened into something stronger than pain, something steadier, something that felt like resolve, spreading slowly through my ribs. I started the engine and pulled away from the house. As the streetlights flickered across the windshield, a thought settled deep within me, calm and certain. This time, they will see me, whether they want to or not. I drove back toward Portland early the next morning with the windows cracked, just enough to let the cool air settle my nerves. The trees along the highway blurred into long green streaks, and for a few miles I let the steady sound of the road fill the silence inside me. I kept replaying my dad's voice telling me to behave, my mom's warning about family image, the quiet sting of being reminded again and again that Chloe's comfort always came before my dignity. But underneath all of that, there was something steadier building in me, a kind of quiet determination that grew stronger the closer I got to Maplewood Estate. When I arrived, the production van was already parked near the service entrance. Crew members moved back and forth, carrying lighting gear, cords, and camera stands. I signed in with the coordinator and headed inside to begin the preliminary setup. The large ballroom echoed slightly, the polished floors still bare, the ceiling chandeliers wrapped in protective cloth. Tom arrived a few minutes later, pushing a dolly with the sample love seat, secured by straps. We had spent nearly all night finishing the last layer of polish on the legs, so the wood caught light the way I wanted. He smiled at me, proud and tired all at once, and together we lifted the piece onto the designated spot near the floral arch. It looked stunning, even without the full setup around it. The velvet fabric glowed a deep forest green, rich and warm. The carved back frame seemed to curve toward the natural light pouring through the tall windows. For a moment, I forgot the tension that had been gripping me all week. Then I heard Chloe's voice. It came from the entry hall, bright and excited the way she always sounded when she was performing for a crowd. She was giving Evan a rush tour of the venue. I could hear her heels clicking quickly across the stone floor as they approached the ballroom. The moment she stepped inside, her smile widened. She was wearing a soft white sweater and fitted jeans, her hair pulled back with a gold clip that made her look like she belonged in a magazine. She glanced around the room, admiring every detail as if she had designed each one herself. Then her eyes landed on the love seat. She inhaled softly and walked toward it. Oh my gosh, Evan, look at this. It is perfect. Exactly what I imagined. The color, the shape, everything. Evan nodded and ran his hand lightly over the velvet. It is beautiful. This place is going to look incredible. For a brief second, I felt a quiet warmth. No, she genuinely liked something I had poured myself into. But the moment did not last long. Elliot walked up behind them, carrying his clipboard. When Chloe asked where the piece had come from, he beamed with pride and said in his smooth, warm tone that the love seat was being restored by an artist named Harper Lane. Chloe's face changed instantly. The glow drained from her expression and something cold replaced it. She blinked once, twice, and then slowly turned her head toward me, where I stood near the doorway. Her voice was tight. Harper. I kept my posture straight, my hands steady at my sides. Yes. She walked over quickly, gesturing sharply for me to follow her to the hallway. When we stepped out of the ballroom, her calm facade cracked. "What are you doing here?" Her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through me. "Why are you inserting yourself into my wedding?" I kept my tone measured. "I am not inserting myself. I was hired by the venue through the show." She shook her head as if I had said something absurd. No, Harper, this is not about work. This is you trying to make this about you. You missed the dress fitting. You have been distant, and now suddenly you show up with furniture for my ceremony. Do you have any idea how this looks? I felt a quiet anger stir in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. It looks like I am doing my job. That is all. Her eyes flared. I do not want your name tied to my wedding. This day is important. Please do not ruin this for me. Do not do this for attention. The words hit me like a slap, not because they were new, but because they were so painfully familiar. Every time something went wrong, every time she felt overshadowed, I became the problem. The shadow she needed to push aside. A memory rose without warning. I was 18, working on a small cabinet I hoped to enter in a local showcase. I had spent weeks carving details into the front panels. Chloe had come into the garage, angry about something trivial. She swung her backpack in frustration and knocked the cabinet off the workbench. It shattered across the floor. Instead of apologizing, she cried to our parents that I had left the piece in her way, and she nearly hurt herself. Dad walked in, saw the mess, and scolded me for being careless, telling me I should know better. I remember standing there with splinters around my feet, feeling completely unseen. The memory faded as Jacob approached us in the hallway, flipping through his schedule. "Harper, quick update. We confirmed your exclusive contract for the restored pieces. Everything stays exactly where planned." He glanced politely at Chloe. "We cannot swap artists or items because the episode is already locked in." Chloe stared at him, stunned for a moment, before shifting her gaze back to me, her jaw tight. It was clear she wanted to argue, but she had nowhere to aim it. She straightened her shoulders and walked off toward Evan, who was still admiring the love seat, unaware of the conflict brewing just a few feet away. I stepped back into the ballroom, letting the quiet settle around me again. The space was still mostly empty, the polished floors shining beneath the soft morning light. The love seat stood at the center like a small anchor holding everything in place. I looked at it, then at the vast room around me, and felt a slow heat spread through my ribs. Not rage, not hurt, something steadier. This time, I will not step back. The ballroom lights were still dim when I whispered to myself that I would not step back. The words stayed with me as I gathered my tools and left Maplewood Estate, and they followed me through the long drive back to Corvallis. By the time I reached my workshop, the sky had turned to deep gray, and a soft drizzle tapped lightly against the roof. It was the kind of quiet Oregon rain that settles into your bones. I turned on the workshop lights and sat for a moment, letting the hum fill the empty space. I had barely settled before my phone buzzed on the table. It was Tommy letting me know he had finished polishing the final panel for one of the console tables. He said he would meet me early in the morning to stain it. I texted him a quick thank you, then flipped the phone over. More messages waited for me in the family group chat, but I did not open them. I had learned to recognize the tone, even without reading the words. It would be full of instructions and reminders and subtle warnings disguised as concern. They had a way of wrapping control inside softness, so you almost felt guilty for noticing the sting. The next day, while Tommy and I were finishing the first coat of varnish on the podium, I got a call from a distant cousin. She was the type who knew everything before anyone else, because she knew how to listen at doors. She said the family was having a private meeting at my parents' house. She said it was about the wedding, and that everyone was there except me. I could hear chatter and clinking glasses behind her before she lowered her voice and added that she thought the meeting was about how to manage me, so I would not upset the big day. I thanked her and hung up without saying much. My hands felt heavier than the tools I held, but I did not stop working. The varnish glowed under the workshop lights like liquid amber. I focused on that. Later that afternoon, someone knocked on the workshop door. I expected Tommy, but when I opened it, Evan stood there instead, hands in his pockets, his hair slightly damp from the mist outside. He smiled politely. "I hope I am not interrupting?" I stepped aside to let him in. He looked around slowly, taking in the stacks of lumber, the polished pieces drying on the racks, and the sketches pinned along the wall. He stopped in front of the love seat frame, running his palm lightly along the carved edge. "This is incredible," he said quietly. I did not know anyone actually built furniture like this anymore. I thanked him, unsure what else to say. He looked different in the workshop light, calmer than he was around Chloe, maybe even more genuine. He turned back to me. "I know there has been tension. I do not know the whole story, but I want you to know I respect your work. I can see how much you put into this." His voice held no hidden edge, no judgment, just sincerity. It startled me more than it should have. I nodded, offering a small smile. He glanced around again, then said he would see me at the estate in a couple of days. When he left, the workshop felt strangely quiet, like his presence had stirred something I was not ready to examine. An hour later, I heard another knock. This time it was my mom. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes swept across the workshop like she had never seen it before. Maybe she had not. She rarely visited. She clasped her hands together. "Harper, we need to talk." I wiped my palms on a rag and waited. She sighed. The kind of sigh that came before a request wrapped inside worry. "Your sister is overwhelmed. She has a lot on her shoulders. People keep asking about the decor and the style of the wedding, and she does not want anyone getting confused. Some people might think you are trying to take credit for her design choices." I stared at her, unable to respond at first, confused. The word churned in my chest. She kept going. "I am not saying you are doing anything wrong. I just think it would help everyone if you did not mention to guests that you are working on the venue. We do not want misunderstandings." Gaslighting had become her second language. She spoke it fluently. I felt my jaw tighten, but my voice stayed even. I never said a word to anyone. I was hired. That is all. She gave a small smile that did not reach her eyes. "I know, sweetheart. I just want to protect the family image. People talk. It can get complicated." She waited for me to agree. I did not. She shifted her purse on her shoulder, clearly unsettled by my silence, then stepped back toward the door. "Just think about what I said." When she left, the workshop felt colder. That evening, I drove back to Maplewood Estate for a production check-in. The sky was still gray, the grounds damp but beautiful in the soft light. I met Jacob near the reception hall, where crew members were positioning early lighting rigs. He waved me over. "Good news. The network wants your interview on the morning of the wedding, around 9. A short segment about your restoration style and why your pieces were chosen." My breath caught in my throat. The morning of the wedding. On camera. In the very place Chloe had told me not to draw attention. I nodded slowly. Jacob smiled, already flipping to the next page of his schedule. We walked through the grand hall together, and he pointed out where the console tables would sit, how the camera would frame them, and where the credits would be placed for the viewers. Everything was mapped out meticulously. After he left, I went to check on the placement cards for the reception. The venue staff had already printed them and placed them in neat stacks. I found the one labeled Featured Artist Display. It held my name in clear, bold print. Seeing it there made something warm and strong rise in my chest. As I turned to leave, I heard Chloe's voice from the far side of the ballroom. She was speaking with another planner, not Elliot, but his assistant. I recognized her tone before I recognized her words. It was sharp and urgent. She pointed toward the entrance display. "I do not want her name front and center. Is there a way to replace that card with something else? Maybe a sign with our initials, or something more elegant. Anything." My stomach dropped. It was not enough that she did not want me involved. She wanted to erase me. The assistant looked uncomfortable. "You would need approval from Elliot for that. It might be tricky, because the production team has already set the layout." Cole huffed, rubbing her forehead. "Just ask. I do not want guests thinking this is her wedding. This is mine." Her words sliced through me, clean and cold. I stayed where I was until she walked away. Then I stepped quietly toward the assistant. She looked startled when she saw me. Before either of us spoke, Elliot approached from behind her. He had clearly overheard part of the conversation, because he shook his head. Gently, "We cannot change the credit displays. It would violate the contract with the show and with the network. Everything stays as arranged." His tone was kind, but firm. I could see him choose his words carefully, but the message was clear. Chloe had tried to erase my work and failed. I thanked him softly. He gave a supportive smile. "Your pieces are exceptional, Harper. They deserve to be acknowledged properly." I walked out into the cool evening air, my steps slow but steady. The estate grounds glowed under the soft path lights. The wind carried the faint scent of cedar and wet earth. I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet wrap around me. Tomorrow will be the rehearsal. The day after would be the wedding. The closer it came, the more the pressure gathered in the air around me. But beneath that pressure, beneath the weight of family expectations and unspoken resentments, something else had begun to rise. Strength. Resolve. A sense of self that felt sturdier than anything they had tried to take from me. I walked to my car with that feeling growing inside me. The night ahead felt heavy, but full of purpose. I knew the storm was coming, and for the first time in a long while, I did not feel afraid of it. The night before the wedding stayed with me even after I left the estate. The cool air, the smell of cedar, the quiet strain in my chest. By the time I pulled into the venue the next morning, the sky was still pale with early light. A thin mist hovered above the lawn, and Maplewood Estate looked almost unreal in that soft glow, like something out of a painting. I arrived earlier than the crew call time, want a moment alone before the day swallowed everything. I parked near the loading entrance and sat for a few seconds, letting my breath settle. When I stepped out of the car, the air bit at my cheeks, crisp and damp. I carried my small toolkit with me, more out of habit than necessity. Inside, the production team was already starting to set up. Lights were being adjusted, microphones tested, cables taped carefully across the floor. Jacob spotted me immediately and walked over with a warm smile and a cup of coffee. Perfect timing. "We are getting ready to film your interview. We want to start near the love seat while the morning light is coming through that back window." I thanked him and followed him down the hallway toward the ballroom. Along the way, I caught a glimpse of myself in a tall, framed mirror. I had chosen a simple charcoal suit with a soft cream blouse. My hair was pinned back at the sides, enough to keep it from falling into my face while still looking neat. It was the kind of outfit that made me feel steady. Not flashy, not invisible, just grounded. The ballroom was glowing as the daylight streamed through the high windows. The love seat sat in its designated spot, already surrounded by soft, floral arrangements that made the green velvet look even richer. The production crew adjusted a few lights while Jacob directed me to stand in front of the love seat. He clipped a small microphone to my blouse and gestured for me to relax my shoulders. "Just speak naturally. Tell us why pieces like this matter to you." The camera rolled, and for a moment, everything outside the frame disappeared. I looked at the love seat, at the carved curves and the smooth velvet fabric, and I let myself remember the nights shaping its frame, sanding its edges, fitting its joints together until the seams vanished. I talked about the history behind old furniture, how each scratch held a story, how restoring something forgotten felt like rescuing a voice that had been silenced. I talked about the way people throw away things they no longer think have value, how beauty often hides beneath layers of wear. The cameraman nodded quietly, as if he understood the weight of what I was saying. Jacob smiled from behind the lens, satisfied. When the interview wrapped, he patted my shoulder. That was perfect. Genuine. "This is going to look beautiful." Crew members scattered to prepare other areas. I stepped aside and watched the ballroom transform. Florists brought in towering arrangement. Endale holders were placed along the aisle, and servers in crisp uniforms began setting tables in the reception hall. Guests started to arrive soon after. The early ones wandered through the ballroom taking photos, drawn to the love seat and console tables. I watched from the side as people touched the velvet, admired the carved legs, murmured about how elegant everything looked. A couple posed together, smiling at the camera while standing beside one of the console tables. A woman in a navy dress ran her palm along the surface, whispering to her friend about how expensive it must have been. I stood quietly, letting the moment wash over me. They did not know it was my work, but their admiration felt like a quiet validation. My family arrived about 30 minutes later. I heard my dad's voice before I saw him, loud and booming the way it always got when he wanted to be the center of attention. He walked into the ballroom with my mom at his side, both dressed impeccably. Mom wore a lilac dress with a matching shawl. David wore a charcoal suit that reminded me too much of his lectures about appearances. They paused near the entrance, taking in the decor. My mom touched one of the floral arrangements and smiled, already narrating to herself how she would describe this to her friends later. Dad stepped closer to the love seat and gave a low whistle. "This is nicer than I expected." He turned to Elliot, who stood nearby reviewing notes on his clipboard. "Who designed all of this? The tables, the love seat, the woodwork? It is impressive." Elliot froze for a brief second, his eyes flicking toward me before he answered. "You will see soon." Dad looked puzzled, but shrugged and walked off toward the ceremony area. I stayed in the background, leaning lightly against a pillar, letting the moment sink into me. I wanted to feel triumphant, but instead, something inside my chest tightened. Maybe it was the memory flickering up from years ago, a memory of a younger me standing in the garage, holding up a small side table I had restored in high school, the kind of project I was proud of for weeks. David barely glanced at it before telling me no one makes real money fixing old junk. He said people wanted new things, not trash polished up to look better. He said it with a certainty that sank into my bones. The echo of that memory mixed with the present, the ballroom full of my work, admired by strangers, unnoticed by my own family. It hurts, even now. The production team began running a sound test on the large projection screen in the reception hall. A few guests gathered near the back, curious. I watched from the side as the screen flickered to life. At first, it showed only color bars and technical patterns. Then, unexpectedly, the test shifted. A short clip of my interview appeared on the screen, the audio low, but clear enough for the nearby guests to hear. It was the section where I talked about finding beauty in things people throw away, how worth can be hidden beneath wear. My voice filled the room, softly echoing against the high ceilings. Guests stopped and listened. A few whispered among themselves. My mom, who had been adjusting a bracelet on her wrist, looked up sharply. Chloe stood beside her in a silk robe, with her hair half-pinned, as she had stepped out briefly from the bridal suite to oversee details. When she saw the screen, her face tightened immediately. She glanced at Mom, who stared with wide eyes. The clip ended abruptly, as the technician switched to another feed, unaware of the tension it had ignited. But the damage was done. I watched from across the room as Chloe and Mom exchanged a look, equal parts panic and anger. Their eyes darted around the ballroom as if trying to locate me. Instead of hiding, I stepped a little forward so they could see me clearly. Cole's lips pressed into a thin line. Mom's jaw clenched. Neither of them approached me yet, but the shock was clear. They had expected my work to stay hidden behind the scenes, anonymous, invisible. They had not expected to see my name or my face associated with the wedding in any visible way. Jacob approached me, handing me a small water bottle. "They are doing final checks on the audio. The full segment will play later during the cocktail hour." He did not seem to notice the tension brewing across the room. I nodded, taking a slow sip to steady myself. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from something almost like release. For the first time, my voice was in the room before anyone tried to silence it. The ceremony was set to begin in less than an hour, but the air was already electric, tight with unspoken words and forced smiles. The wedding day was only beginning, and the real explosion was still ahead. The hallway outside was humming with music and chatter. The ceremony will begin soon, and for the first time in my life, I walked back toward the noise without shrinking. The day was not over, and the final moment was still waiting for me. But the moment I stepped out of that room, the swirl of sounds, colors, and faces hit me at once. Guests were moving toward the ceremony lawn, guided by ushers in soft gray suits. Someone laughed loudly near the double doors. Someone else complimented the floral arches. The scent of roses, eucalyptus, and cedar drifted through the air in warm waves. I stood there for a second, grounding myself. Through the open doorway, I could hear faint music from the quartet warming up near the pond. Violins trailed through the breeze like delicate threads weaving the morning. Together. The world felt full, alive, buzzing with anticipation. But underneath all of it, the tension crackled like static. I could feel it clinging to me, searching for a place to land. I took a slow breath and stepped into the flow of people. A cluster of guests moved aside as I passed, still chatting about the video clip. One man with silver hair turned to me and smiled politely. "That interview was lovely. You spoke with such heart." My wife said your words reminded her of an old heirloom table she refuses to throw away. You gave meaning to that. I thanked him, feeling that warm curl of surprise again. It still felt strange to be seen so clearly by strangers, while being invisible. To my own family. Across the room, I saw Dad standing near the refreshment table again. His posture was stiff, like someone had hammered a metal rod down his spine. Mom hovered beside him, adjusting the sleeve of his suit, as if that tiny movement might distract from the fact that their older daughter had just taken a spotlight they never intended to share. I could see the embarrassment on her face, even from a distance. She always cared more about what people whispered behind closed doors than what she said to her own children in private. Her shoulders tightened with each guest that walked by the display featuring my name. David turned his gaze sharply toward me, our eyes locking for a split second. Something flickered there, something I had rarely seen directed at me. Maybe it was a shock. Maybe it was resentment. Maybe it was the first tiny crack in the wall he had built between himself and any version of my life he did not choose to approve of. Either way, he turned away before I could interpret it fully. I kept walking. A group of bridesmaids fluttered past, their dresses a soft champagne color that shimmered under the chandeliers. They laughed loudly, half excited, half anxious as they clutched their bouquets. One of them slowed as she passed me. "Are you a furniture artist?" I loved that clip they played. It made me tear up a little. My grandma used to refinish old cabinets. Your work feels like home. Her sincerity caught me off guard. I told her I appreciated that, and she squeezed my arm lightly before hurrying after the others. Nearby, the florist's assistants were arranging the last delicate stems into the large ceremony arch. Everything was almost set. For a moment, I let myself take it all in. The glow of the polished wooden tables, the flash of the brass fixtures, the softness of the velvet love seat that sat like a jewel at the far end of the ballroom. My pieces, my hands, my skill. I had made this beauty. I had shaped it. I brought it here, and nothing they said could take that away. Elliot approached, checking his watch. He looked relieved when he saw me standing calmly in the center of the room. Everything is on schedule. After the ceremony, guests will come back inside for cocktails. That is when your full-feature screen will roll. He lowered his voice slightly. You should be proud. This is going to make an impression. I nodded, feeling the weight of what he said settle warmly in my chest. Suddenly, a loud voice cut through the air. Harper! I turned. Dad walked toward me with long, rigid strides. Mom trailed behind him, her face flushed and tight. Dad stopped just a few feet away. He looked around to make sure no one was close enough to overhear before he spoke. What is all this? His voice cracked slightly. Why is your name everywhere? Why is your face on a screen at your sister's wedding? I held his gaze. Because I worked on this wedding. You should have told us. His jaw clenched. You made us look like fools. People are asking questions. The family is confused. You blindsided us. I felt a familiar old ache spark inside me. But for the first time, it did not take control. I kept my tone level. You never asked about my work. You never asked what I was doing. You never asked anything unless it involved Chloe. How exactly was I supposed to tell you something you never wanted to hear? He stared at me for a long moment, like he was seeing a stranger. Mom reached forward, lightly touching his arm as if reminding him to lower his voice before someone noticed. We need to talk about this later, she whispered. I said nothing. They walked away, leaving the faint scent of my mom's perfume lingering in the air. As I turned back toward the ballroom, I saw Evan watching from near the ceremony doors. His expression softened when he caught my eye. He walked over slowly, as if giving me time to say no. When I did not move, he stopped next to me. Are you all right? I nodded. I think so. He glanced toward his parents, who were chatting with a guest, then back at me. I want you to know something. Cole and her family have a way of controlling narratives. But what you said earlier about choosing yourself, that meant something. You are talented. More than talented. His words were simple but sincere, and they mattered more than I expected them to. Before I could reply, the coordinator called for the guests to begin taking their seats outside. Music from the quartet swelled, filling the hallway with warm, elegant sound. The sunlight streaming through the glass doors made the ceremony lawn glow. People began to file out, chattering excitedly about the bride, the decorations, and the weather. I stayed back near the rear of the ballroom, where I could watch without getting in anyone's way. Chloe appeared in the hallway then, wearing her wedding gown. It was a beautiful dress, fitted through the bodice with delicate lace sleeves that shimmered in the light. She was radiant, in the way brides often are, but her face still held traces of anger. Her jaw was tight and her eyes darted around nervously. She saw me standing by the pillar. Her gaze lingered for a second, filled with something like resentment wrapped in panic. But she did not approach me. Instead, she turned away quickly, adjusting her bouquet as Marissa fussed over her train. The ceremony began moments later. Guests stood as Chloe walked down the aisle on Dad's arm. His expression softened with pride he had never shown me. The music rose. Camera shutters clicked. People dabbed their eyes with tissues. It was a beautiful ceremony. I stood quietly near the back of the lawn, watching two people exchange vows under the floral arch. The sunlight filtered through the trees, catching on Chloe's veil. She looked happy in some moments, anxious in others. But every now and then, she flicked her gaze toward the ballroom doors, as if afraid someone would mention the screen again. When the pastor pronounced them married, the guests erupted into applause. Chloe and Evan kissed, smiling at each other with real warmth. I found myself wishing them well, despite everything. They deserved peace, even if Chloe did not know how to offer it to others. The guests followed the newlyweds back toward the reception hall. The cocktail hour was about to begin, and that was when the second half of the feature video would play. Jacob had told me earlier that this segment included shots of the workshop, footage of me restoring the wood, slow pans over the furniture, and a narration about my philosophy on restoration. The thought of it playing at Chloe's wedding felt surreal, not because I wanted to overshadow her, but because I had spent years shrinking myself to make room for her. And now, the world had finally noticed me. Inside the ballroom, people gathered near the bar, chatting as servers passed around trays of small appetizers. The room glowed with soft candlelight. The furniture fit perfectly into the space, as if it had always belonged there. Then the lights dimmed again. The screen flickered. Guests slowly turned toward it, quieting. The second feature began. Footage of my workshop filled the room. The camera panned across stacks of aged wood, brushes, stains, clamps, chisels. Then me at the workbench, sanding a curved armrest, leaning close to inspect the grain. My voice narrated over the visuals. Restoration is a conversation between the past and the present. You have to listen carefully. You have to be patient. You have to believe there is something worth saving, even when others stop looking. People watched with thoughtful expressions. Some nodded. Some murmured softly. Then the next line played. I rebuilt these pieces the same way I rebuilt my life. Slowly. Quietly. After years of being dismissed by the people closest to me. After years of feeling invisible. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw my mom press her lips together. Dad stood rigid, as if bracing for impact. Chloe's shoulders tensed so sharply that her veil fluttered slightly. The video continued. I learned that you do not need permission to become who you are meant to be. You do not need applause. You do not need validation. You just need courage to keep going. The room was silent. Even the string quartet musicians paused near the corner, watching. When the video ended, the applause that followed was soft, but genuine. It carried a warmth that filled the space between each clap. I felt a swell of something deep inside me. Not pride exactly, something steadier, something like belonging, for the first time in a place where they never meant for me to stand tall. But the moment the applause faded, Chloe's heels clicked sharply across the floor. She pushed through the crowd with her veil swaying behind her like a trailing sheet of tension. She reached me with her breath tight and her bouquet trembling in her grip. Come with me, now. The bridal suite door shut behind us with a soft thud. The room smelled of hairspray, roses, and leftover tension. A champagne flute sat half empty on the vanity. Chloe turned to me with eyes that burned. "Why would you do this? Why would you embarrass me? Why could you not just stay quiet? You always have to make everything about you." Her voice cracked. "This was supposed to be perfect. You ruined it." I stared at her, letting her words settle the way they always had when we were younger. But this time, they did not sink into me. They slid off. I took a slow breath before speaking. "I did not ruin anything. I elevated your wedding. Everything in that ballroom looks beautiful because I put my heart into it. You got the wedding of your dreams." She blinked as if I had slapped her. I stepped closer, my voice steady. "You wanted me hidden. You wanted me small. You wanted me quiet, so you could be the only one shining. But I did not steal your spotlight. I simply lit my own." Her face crumpled with shock and disbelief. I opened the door. The music and voices from the ballroom spilled into the hallway, warm and alive. Without looking back, I stepped through it, leaving her stunned in the middle of the bridal suite. The night was far from over, and so was everything waiting to come. I stepped through the doorway and let the music and voices wash over me again. The ballroom felt warmer somehow, fuller, as if the air had shifted after that confrontation. Guests moved around the bar and the buffet tables, laughing and talking, unaware of the storm that had just passed in the bridal suite. The lights glowed against the polished wood, catching on the brass accents I had restored. Every piece I had created stood proudly in the center of the room, and for the first time all evening, I allowed myself to look at them without bracing for someone to cut me down. I walked toward the far corner where I had kept my jacket earlier. My hands were still trembling slightly from the adrenaline, but my chest felt lighter than it had in years. That room had been a cage for me once, a place where I bent myself into silence just to keep the peace. Today, it has become something else, a place where I reclaimed the voice I lost a long time ago. I reached the corner and slipped on my jacket. The fabric felt cool against my arms. For a moment, I just stood there, letting my breathing settle. The next steps would matter. And as much as I wanted to leave the venue immediately, I knew something else would come, like loose ends tugging for closure. I did not have to wait long. I saw my mom approaching from across the ballroom. Her steps were slower than usual. Her expression looked softer, but also strained, like she had spent the last few minutes rehearsing something she did not fully believe. Behind her, the guests were lining up for the first round of hors d'oeuvres, and the chatter dipped whenever someone passed the sign with my name printed in elegant lettering. My mom stopped in front of me. Her pearls, the same set she had owned since I was a child, trembled at her collarbone. "Harper." She said my name like it was delicate, easily breakable. "I think we should talk." I waited. She wrung her hands once, glancing around as if she needed to make sure no one was looking before she continued. "We did not mean it that way. The things we said, the things Chloe said, it came out wrong." Her eyes slid to the floor. Her voice dropped low enough that only I could hear. "We would never try to hurt you on purpose." Something inside me went still. It felt like the emotional version of stepping into cold water. A shock, then a clarity so sharp it lifted something heavy from my shoulders. I remembered all the years I had spent twisting myself into knots to hear Anne. Apology like this. Something to acknowledge the hurt, something to ease the ache. But now that the words were finally in front of me, I felt strangely detached, as if those old wounds no longer needed their bandages. I kept my voice calm. "You meant every word, Mom. Maybe not out of cruelty, maybe not out of hate, but you meant them. You believed them, and they shaped who I became in that house." She flinched. Her eyes darted again around the room as if she feared someone might overhear. I opened my palms gently, steady and measured. "I am not angry. I am just done. I do not live for your approval anymore. I do not need you to see my value to know that it is there." Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Her fingers curled into each other, twisting nervously. Before she could respond, Dad approached. His footsteps sounded heavy, slower than normal. as though each one carried weight he did not know how to put down. He joined us, but kept a few feet of distance, like he did not quite know if he deserved to stand close. He looked at me, then looked away. His jaw tightened and relaxed, tightened again. The silence stretched. For a moment, I thought maybe he would try. Maybe he would reach for some version of the truth. Maybe he would say something human, something fatherly, something real. But he did not. He swallowed once and stared at the floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He could not look at me. He could not speak to me. He could not even pretend to mend the crack between us. And that told me everything. I let the silence be the answer neither of us was willing to name. My mom finally whispered that she hoped we could talk again sometime. I did not promise anything. I simply nodded once, gently, and stepped past them. I walked through the ballroom doors and out into the hallway. Behind me, the wedding reception began to swell with new music. The string quartet transitioned to a livelier melody. Guests clapped. Someone shouted for the newlyweds. Laughter rose and faded, but I was already gone. Outside, the evening air had cooled. The sun hovered low above the horizon, washing the sky with muted gold. The soft hum of crickets filled the distance around the estate, blending with faint music seeping out the windows. I walked slowly across the parking lot, feeling the gravel shift under my heels. My car sat near the back row, where I had parked early that morning before the cameras arrived. When I finally opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, the silence wrapped around me like a warm blanket. I sat there for a long moment with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing in the stillness. The inside of the car smelled faintly of cedar from the wood samples I had carried earlier. I was alone, and I was at peace. The tears never came, neither did the shaking. My heart stayed steady, quiet, certain. For the first time in years, I felt like I had nothing left to explain. I started the engine, watching the headlights illuminate the gravel ahead. The gates of Maplewood Estate opened slowly as I approached, and once I crossed through them, I felt something release inside me, like a bird unhooking its claws from a cage. The drive back to Corvallis took nearly an hour. The road wound through stretches of tall pines and quiet farmland. I rolled down the window and let the cool air rush in. Each mile felt like shedding the last remnants of a life I no longer wanted to carry. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, the sky had darkened into deep blue. The first stars blinked overhead. I passed familiar corners and old diners, the laundromat where I had mended old covers before I could afford a workshop, and the hardware store where I bought my first power sander on clearance. My workshop came into view at the end of a gravel driveway. The lights inside were still on. I saw movement through the windows. Jimmy must have stayed late, probably finishing the polishing on the antique chest we had started together. I parked and walked inside. Tom looked up from the workbench when he heard the door. His sleeves were rolled up, sawdust clinging to his forearms. He grinned the second he saw me. "You made it back." He brushed his hands on a rag and walked over. "I watched the coverage on the live stream. They showed your video twice." "Twice, Harper." A laugh escaped from me, soft but real. He studied my face for a moment. His expression shifted with quiet concern. "Are you okay?" I nodded. "Better than I have been in a long time." He relaxed and leaned against the workbench. I told him I would finish the chest tomorrow, but I wanted to check my email before heading home. He smiled and went back to his work, humming something under his breath. I crossed the workshop to my desk in the corner. The lamp cast a warm yellow circle over the laptop, illuminating the scratches and stains on the tabletop. This desk had seen years of long nights, failed experiments, small victories. It has been my refuge in every season of my life. I opened the laptop. The inbox pinged repeatedly, one notification after another flooding the screen. Projects, commissions, partnerships. A museum in Chicago wanted to collaborate on a mid-century exhibit. A design blogger from Texas wanted an interview. A hotel chain in New England had seen the feature clip and wanted to commission custom tables for 3 of their properties. And at the top of the inbox, a message from the television network. An invitation. "We would like to offer you a full contract for 2 additional seasons of American Restoration Stories. Your work and presence are exceptional. We hope you will join us." I stared at the screen, stunned. Then letting the weight of it settle over me like a warm quilt. Every doubt, Every insult, every time someone told me I was not enough, dissolved into something distant and irrelevant. Tommy looked over from the bench. What happened? I turned the laptop so he could see. His eyes widened. You got it, Harper. You really got it. His joy was so genuine, it made my throat tighten with emotion. I stood up and crossed the workshop, letting the energy fill me from head to toe. I felt grounded, strong, whole. I turned back toward him. I am better than ever. We both laughed softly. The kind of laugh that carries relief and triumph tangled together. I stayed in the workshop for another hour, organizing tools, wiping down surfaces, letting my body unwind. The night grew quieter outside. The crickets faded into soft background music. I could still feel the weight of the ballroom on my skin, but now it felt like something I had risen above instead of something pressing down on me. When I finally stepped outside, the air was crisp. A thin layer of mist hung low over the ground. I locked up the workshop, then turned to look at the building one more time. This place had been my sanctuary, my classroom, my savings account when I had nothing else, my therapy, my truth. Tonight, it became my future. I walked to my car feeling lighter than I had in years. I rested my hand on the door handle and let a slow breath fill my lungs. At dinner, my dad called me pathetic. Today, without shouting, without revenge, without raising my voice once, I proved them wrong. The quiet had carried the message louder than anything else could have. Before getting in my car, I turned my face up toward the sky. The stars were brighter now. The night stretched wide and open, like a road that waited for me alone. I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was never going to shrink myself again. I got into the car, closed the door, and let the silence settle gently around me for one last moment before starting the engine. And as I drove home, a warmth spread through my chest. Not pride, not anger, but something calmer. Something like truth. Something like freedom. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this. Silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.